The 12th of May, 1849. The kind of morning in Beaufort County, South Carolina, that felt heavier than the weather suggested. The Spanish moss hung so low from the live oaks it brushed the carriage roofs. The river moved slow and dark as if it were thinking, and the smell of rice and smoke lay on the land like a second skin. In those years, men measured themselves in acres and bloodlines, in who they bought and who they sold. Property law was a gospel, and mercy a private indulgence for those with time to waste. Eleanor Whitfield had few indulgences left. The mercantile ledger she kept behind her parlor screen showed debts as neat and cruel as any overseer's tally. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had been a man who wore his resentments like a coat. Never enough esteem, always one more slight to avenge. He had not returned from the river that winter. He had gone out in a canoe, drunk and angry, and the currents there had long teeth for pride, or so the coroner wrote. The truth was, there had been more than water and shame. Thomas had been embroiled in a feud with a man from the next parish, and when the smoke of that fight had cleared, there had been whispers that he had done something darker to a family that once worked under him, a hospitality of cruelty that Eleanor had tried to ignore until it became impossible. Word traveled in crooked ways among the enslaved and the free. A rumor is often the most honest thing in a county. They said that Thomas Whitfield had sold a family in a fit of cruel sport, mother, father, and 2 children, to a trader bound for Alabama. The trader's ledger showed an account paid in full. Nobody from the parish would ask questions. When the truth began to bite at Eleanor's softer edges, she could not quiet it with ledgers or plantation rights. The county had long ago decided to forgive Thomas in the currency of gossip, but gossip does not settle debts with men who keep ledgers either. Eleanor's daughter, Beatrice, was a woman of 29 whose presence and company unsettled the polite conversation, even as they pretended otherwise. She had the round face and slow laugh of someone who had been taught to be harmless. Her dresses were cut to hide more than they revealed. When she entered a room, gentlemen inclined to look away to avoid the impropriety of pity. Beatrice had inherited her mother's appetite for sweets and her father's temper, though the temper had taken on a different shape, not sharp as a knife, but dense as a bruise. For years she swallowed indignities inside like loaves, pressing them into the pillow of her silence until she could not hear the world properly. Eleanor bought the man on May 1. The auction held in a square that smelled of mud and horse and a kind of civilized hunger. The trader, a man named Clyde Barrow, presented the lot as if selling a tool, a steady hand, carpenter's work, knows herbs, he said. The man himself sat on a wooden block beneath a tarpaulin, hands laced, eyes calm in a way that made a clerk stop his tally for a breath. His name, in his own voice a low baritone, was Jeremiah Cole. He was 34, broad-shouldered and lean, the kind of man whose strength looked built for labor and patience in equal measure. He had a scar down his palm from a split log, and a white line across his jaw that suggested a blow not given lightly. When Eleanor bid, people around her shifted as if they had seen someone too small for the role she had chosen to play. She brought him home that evening in a wagon that smelled of tar and old wine, and the household adjusted servants whispering in corners, dogs untrusting. The air on the manor steps thick with the newness of a decision. Jeremiah, when introduced, refused to lower his eyes in the practiced way most did. He looked at the girl Eleanor had told him to mind, and when Beatrice met his gaze, she did not look away. There was a glance that held 1,000 small reckonings in it, and, in the way of people who think of danger like weather, each felt a lightning strike. What the county did not know, what most never know about long histories, is how small beginnings hide the outlines of a story that will not be caged. Jeremiah's past was not catalogued in the trader's papers. He had once had a house with a smoke-bleached porch and a family who made names for themselves the way families do, quietly, with pillars of habit. He had been a man who could cut a table so fine the grain would tell the story of a season. He had also been a man who loved a wife named Liza and a son and daughter who sang for mornings. The ledger that tracked their sale to a far county had been written in a hand that still smelled to Jeremiah of Thomas Whitfield's favor. Thomas had been in the crowd when the family had been priced. He had watched the children like a man who counts the worth of anything with the shadow of a smile. Someone at the auction had smiled back. The trader's ledger showed a note, bought as requested. Jeremiah had never seen his family again. The memory of that white-draped buyer smiling like someone selecting a book to burn became a coal in his chest. It was dull and constant, and hot enough to shape the work of his hands into something else. Eleanor told the county a practical story. Thomas had wished for a man with skill to keep the property together, and with him gone, she needed hands and knowledge. She spoke of the boy's calmness and his competence as if naming it would make it true. She told Beatrice with equal sincerity that Jeremiah would serve as a helper, a companion in the house, someone to keep a lid on the chores that had been left to her since mourning had taught people to censor their grief. "He will be company," she said. "Nothing more." But what Eleanor could not anticipate, what no one could, was how a person with a patient wound learns to make plans the way a carpenter measures twice and cuts once. Jeremiah arrived with nothing but a small bundle wrapped in a gray cloth. When he unrolled it, it revealed a thin, cramped photograph, tucked inside a syrup-stained paper. A woman's handwriting had written, "Liza, remember." The name alone was a map. Beatrice's first nights under Jeremiah's watch were restless. She had the habit, learned from those who would smile politely at suffering, of pretending the body is not a geography of memory. At supper, she would pick at her plate, tuck a napkin over her hand if someone looked. She had been taught that eating too much made you too visible. She had been told that women are meant to be appetiteless in public and private. Jeremiah watched her the way a carpenter watches grain. He noted the tremor, as someone would note the warp in a board. He saw the way she was medicated by a household physician whose charge included tinctures laced with opiates. He had seen such practice before. He had seen women made small in rooms heavy with laudanum. He did not speak of it, but he bowed his head at night and thought of the ledger entry that had split him from his children. If Beatrice was to be kept soft on purpose, he thought, then there was room here for something darker than comfort. Their alliance began, as alliances do, in the furtive architecture of necessity. Beatrice was ashamed to speak at first, ashamed to say aloud that sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could see a cellar door swinging and shapes moving in its choked light. It was a memory she blamed on melancholy and too many pills. She called it hysteria when she spoke to the gentle doctor. When she told Jeremiah not as confessions but as fragments, he listened without untouched pity. There was a steadiness in the way he asked questions that felt like a counsel. "When?" he would ask. "Who?" And she would supply the answers with the edged clarity of someone who had been rehearsed in not being believed. She told him, finally, of the night her father had taken the Whitfield ledger of guests and sealed it in a chest in the cellar, of the late hours and whispered footsteps, and the way certain men had told terrible jokes in the dark. "They say it's tradition," she said once. "They say it binds us standing together in this way. They say it is how order is kept." Jeremiah thought of his wife's hands, of the last night he had watched their faces through a crack in a door as they were led away. He thought of the buyer from Beaufort, smiled, like a man who had read the price tag and found it fair. He straightened his shoulders, and, as any man who has loved and lost does, he planned, with the slow engineering of grief. First, they needed proof. Rumors were wind. They needed ledger and sign. Beatrice's memories were a map of sorts, a map that placed certain evenings at the Whitfield house. One of those evenings, marked by a night, Thomas had gone to a meeting and returned with a leather-bound ledger under his arm. Jeremiah took his chance on May 14th, when Eleanor hosted a small dinner for women in the neighboring parsonage, and most of the men had gone to a June fair in Charleston. The house was a web of habits then, servants on their rounds, windows left ajar for cross breeze, the cellar door rarely watched in daylight. They moved like two thieves with an unusual right, Beatrice with the small blue dress that made her seem harmless, and Jeremiah with the apprentice's gait of a carpenter who knows where boards creak. They descended the cellar steps like a pair of confessions. The air grew cool and smelled of river and old wood. A lantern swung, throwing long hands on walls. The cellar was a place of the Whitfields' private gospel casks of pickled things, a table for counting, several crates stamped with initials. In the back, behind casks and broom handles, the ledger waited in a chest bound with iron. Jeremiah's fingers opened locks with a patience earned by a dozen small betrayals. Keys were less necessary than resolve. When they lifted the ledger out, the pages smelled of cedar and other people's sin. The handwriting was clinical. Names of men followed by curious entries, dates, offerings, sacrament of harvest. There were lists of attendees and locations, and a notation of those acquitted with particular rituals. There, written in a hand that looked like a judge, was Thomas Whitfield's signature. They left with the ledger tucked beneath loose clothing, like a contraband heart. That night they read by candlelight, Beatrice's finger tracing names, and Jeremiah murmuring dates. It was worse than rumor, it was the bones of a conspiracy. The ledger outlined gatherings where the county's powerful men described rituals that mixed Old English rites with cruel oaths. The ledger kept names like a spider keeps flies. Among them was an entry showing Thomas overseeing sales of people as gifts to cement ties. The page with that note was water-stained, as if someone had tried to dissolve guilt with whiskey and found it did not wash. Once the ledger was proof, their plan thickened. Words alone would not move the county. A woman recently pulled from opiate stupor and an enslaved man would be easy to dismiss. They needed a scene that would not allow for plausible deniability. They needed the men to see the ledger and to be forced into a room that could not swallow their testimony. The ledger itself could bring lawsuits and ruin, but the men who wrote in it had power enough to buy lawyers and judges. Jeremiah understood the law's shape in a way the county rarely admitted. It bends where money grabs it, but it rusts under the weight of undeniable exposure. On the evening of June 3rd, when the river lay flat as a plate and the lavender bushes by the path smelled of late spring, Jeremiah and Beatrice made their move. Eleanor had invited a select circle of men for a study evening, a genteel pretext to gather and read from books of law and agriculture. The Whitfield dining room was polished, the candelabra heavy with wax. Men arrived in coats that did not fit the weather, as if they were armoring themselves against accusation. They ate quietly. The house hummed with the politeness of sin. As the men settled and gossip thickened like gravy, Beatrice excused herself with the practiced smile of women taught to be invisible and went to the parlor. She returned with a tray of wine and stacked cups and, in the motion of serving, slipped the ledger beneath one of the platters as if it were nothing. Then the air changed. Beatrice, who had rehearsed her old nausea into a weapon, coughed and feigned a faint. A servant called for water, and Jeremiah had placed himself near the fireplace with the composure of someone who had already decided the night's geometry. When light fell back and Beatrice's eyes opened, there was suddenly the ledger, a slate laid bare on the table. Jeremiah rose and, with a voice that had the steady, soft teeth of a man telling of a storm, said to the room, "There is proof of what you have done." A laugh began soft and pent up, the kind that is the reflex of a man who thinks laughter will be the safe refuge from shame. But something in the ledger's presence curdled it. As men reached to push it aside, Jeremiah read, voice low and exact. He read names and dates. He read a notation about sacrament and gifted labor, and when he pronounced a certain name, the name of a judge who had smiled at his children's play once, like a man who owned the future, the laugh cut off like a lamp blown in an open draft. The room smelled suddenly of old perfumes and new terror. The men rose as a single animal might if the floor opened beneath them. Words were thrown like knives, accusations, denials, threats. Two of them lurched for doors. Jeremiah kept reading. Beatrice did not cry or cry out. She straightened as if someone had adjusted the spine in her body and read the page that named Thomas as an overseer of several sales. She turned the ledger toward Eleanor with a motion like offering the heart of the house on a platter. Eleanor, whose hands had always folded into precise gestures, felt the floor move under the ledger and heard her late husband's name rung out in a room that smelled of citrus and treason. The men around her looked very old there, suddenly shaggy with panic. What happened next was not cinematic in the way a novel might paint it. It was small, ugly, and logical. The men considered the ledger as one considers an injury. Can it be denied? No. Can it be bought off? Perhaps. Will there be witnesses that will believe a woman and an enslaved man? The ledger could be burned. The men could burn the house to erase proof, and then argue scalded wood in court. Danger breeds its own courage. When a man fears for his standing, he finds brutality in his pocket like a loose coin. 2 men lunged for Jeremiah. The candles guttered. A chair snapped. In the scuffle, the ledger fell open to the final pages. Names arranged beneath the words membership. And beside each, an annual offering not only of money, but of favor. The room became a field of small violences. Jeremiah, who had been a carpenter and a healer and a father, moved with a naked clarity. He did not swing wildly. He used the force of a man who had been taught patience like a tool. Men fell in ways that hurt them, as people hurt when they wake from self-delusion. Beatrice watched, her hands steady, as those who pretended to civility found their faces revealed. When the first body hit the rug, the room's music changed from panic to dread. By the time the county constable was roused, which took 2 hours and a great deal of rising, the house had become a scene the law did not like to name. 13 men, the ledger would later show, had been counted that night among the injured or dead. Some fell in the scuffle, broken by the blunt economy of desperate men. Others were felled by their own hands as they tried to strike first. The accounts the county pieced together in subsequent weeks were amendments of cruelty and fear. Newspapers called it a disturbance and printed the Whitfield name with the same greedy italics as they used for scandal. In the days after, cavalry moved through the estate like a tide. Families who had once smiled at Beatrice's table pivoted away. Some lawyers came with the polite swagger of vultures. Eleanor, who had spent a life baking soft lies into bread, found herself at a window watching the river as if it might wrap itself around the property and take everything away. Jeremiah was seized and put in irons. The county wanted a public spectacle, an example. The ledger vanished in the legal churn and reappeared as a piece of evidence in hearings that dragged like summer. Men who had been counted among the powerful offered testimony of differing shapes, their stories changing like the weather. Yet there is always a cause to certain balances. Jeremiah's hands were shackled in the county jail, but his eyes remained free. From the window slit, he watched the people who once called themselves friends turn to stone. He thought of Liza in the Alabama dust and of the small photograph he had folded each night. He thought of Beatrice, who had slept and not woken to a posture of the same old shame. In the end, the ledger did not make the decision alone. The people most invested in the old order made bargains in the dark. But Beatrice's clear voice and Jeremiah's unflinching testimony, and a handful of others who had long been ignored, made a different kind of pressure. By the following autumn, several men had been indicted, though many escaped full judgment by the messy arithmetic of influence and money. Some were ruined, their names stripped from town councils and parishes. A few fled. The county's polite society fractured into factions, and the Whitfield Manor, once a bright place of ballrooms and polite laughter, lurched under the weight of its own history. Eleanor walked the grounds in a way that suggested confusion more than contrition. She had spent her life keeping accounts in the ledger of respectability. When the numbers were turned, she found nothing to tally that would buy her a better ending. Jeremiah's fate, like many endings to stories the county tells quietly, was both public and private. He sat in the county dock and spoke. He named names. He told, with the compact force of someone who has held grief in his hands until it became a usable thing, of the auction and the smile that had sealed his family's fate. He told of Thomas Whitfield and how a man's pleasure and domination had cost him what he loved. He said quietly that his aim had been not to spill needlessly, but to ensure that some ledger could not continue to be written with the lives of the powerless. For those words, for the ledger, for the men who had been made to look at themselves, The county offered a kind of compromise. Jeremiah would not hang. Instead, he would be sold not to the deep south, but to a northern trader who promised workhouses and an uncertain mercy. It was the law's suggestion of mercy where it could not afford to apply justice. Before the sale, on a morning that smelled of rain and roasted corn, Beatrice came to see him one last time. She sat on the bench, outside the jail, with her hands folded. Her face had thinned. She looked older and sharper, like someone who had taken a blade to soft things. She held a small packet in her lap, a piece of her dress sewn into a tiny pouch, inside which was the photograph from Jeremiah's own bundle. She pressed it into his hand. "For Liza," she said, "for remembering." Jeremiah took it as one takes an offered hand across a wide water. He did not promise to write, though he wanted to. He did not ask for things he could not have. This is how they parted, with the ledger's ghost still warm in the county's mouth, with neither triumph nor tidy victory, but with the knowledge that names had been set down differently. In the years that followed, some of the men named in that ledger found themselves stripped of committees. A parish stood still when a name was read aloud. But the system that created the ledger remained. It is a stubborn thing, like an old oak in a field. Still, a change had threaded through the county like a new seam. Beatrice lived on. She took up, after a time, the keeping of the Whitfield house in a way that felt less like an inheritance and more like a stewardship. She learned trades that made her hands busy and her mind less given to the worry of being seen as fragile. She lent what she could to those who needed a place to sleep when a rumor of trouble spun too fast. Sometimes, when the light hit a certain way in the parlor, she would stand and imagine the ledger lying open on a table and the faces around it. And she would press a hand to her heart and feel the thud of something that had been given back. As for Jeremiah, life took him along routes he could not have planned. He was sold northwards, and though he never saw Liza again, letters later told of an alley in a small New England town where a carpenter's table bore the mark of a man's hands who knew to measure twice and cut once. There were stories that his name traveled in the mouths of those who had leaned to listen. A small tale, an ember, not enough to set fields aflame, but enough to warm a night. History keeps its long ledger in different rooms. Not all accounts balance neatly, but on certain nights, when the cicadas sang and the river moved slow and reflective, someone in Beaufort County would tell the story of the ledger found in a cellar and of a woman and a man who read it aloud until polite society could no longer claim ignorance. And when they did, there would be a nod toward the house, with its wide porches, and a small private silence for what had been given back, however imperfectly. If you like this story and want more tales from the past pulled into the open, drop a like and subscribe. It helps us bring history's hidden corners to light.